Time catches up with everybody. Well, here's something I haven't done in a little while. Time for a Big Finish review. Even though I've kind of taken these off the dockets, at least in terms of them being a regular feature, I have had the joy of having some of my Patreon supporters commission some specific reviews of stories they really wanted me to do. And this time, that was the 8th Doctor Time War set, Series 1. I think there have been 4 of these to date. At time of recording? I think so. Anyway, this is the first series of such, and it does deal with how the Time War is starting to impede and encroach on the 8th Doctor, aka Paul McGann's life. Now, if you aren't especially familiar with the Big Finish and extra material that is out there, of which I'm only really just starting to skim the surface of myself, and you stick to the main show itself, you may only really know Paul McGann either from the TV movie in 1996 or from, more likely, the short Night of the Doctor. If you've never seen Night of the Doctor, seriously, pause this, go watch it. It's about 8 minutes. Come on back, and you'll understand why it's great to get anything more with Paul McGann. Now, since I can now safely assume everyone has seen Night of the Doctor, we definitely get the implication there that he really tried to not get involved in the Time War. That would seem to be his mission in so many ways. Like, I am not getting involved in this thing. Well, this series shows that his decision to stay out of it, that's not a choice that's easy to follow through on, because this thing was so big and so all-encompassing that you kind of couldn't get away from it. So, there are 4 stories in this set, as there usually is in the box sets, at least most of the ones that I have encountered up to this point. So I'm going to take these one at a time. I will avoid spoilers for as long as I can. I am going to have to get into spoilers talking about the last one in particular, because some of the stuff that is especially interesting about that one requires spoilers. The other ones, I think, keep it pretty decently spoiler-free, really only talking about general premise. So, the first part is the Starship of Theseus, which is a very clever and interesting piece. The first thing is, if you are at all familiar, which I am, with the philosophical thought exercise, the Ship of Theseus, then you might kind of suss out some of the tricks that this particular episode has up its sleeve. But even if you see them coming, they are very well implemented as the Time War starts to encroach on this ship that the Doctor and his companion Sheena just kind of turn up on. And they're just, it's a cruise ship, like, oh, well, this will be fun. But then things just start to shift and alter, and something is very, very wrong about the way that this thing moves about in space and how it gets from point A to point B, and a certain toll that has to be paid. So McGann is great in all of these, top to bottom, from the back. He is just terrific. So I don't even really need to reiterate that again. And we also in this meet the characters that we're actually going to be sticking with through the entirety of the run, because there are a number of characters coming off of this adventure who will continue to be with the Doctor. Most notably the character of Bliss, who effectively serves as a new companion by the time the thing's wrapped up. And there's also a couple named Quarren and Rupa. And there are a few other characters as well, but these are the main ones that are going to carry over. And so they all get introduced, and the ways in which they are each going to be significant isn't immediately apparent, but it's interesting watching that develop over the course of this. And this story is interesting because I think one of the things that this box set does especially well is showing the ways in which the Time War is impacting reality, the way that it is causing collateral damage, and how some of the weapons of the Time War get used and the fallout from the use of them. And that starts right off the bat with this, and that is kind of the through line that continues through the entirety of this thing. That the way in which this war gets waged, it causes damage of a completely different nature from anything else you'd normally expect from fallout of a war. So we get that right off the bat with Ship of Theseus, and then it goes into Echoes of War. Now, Echoes of War is sort of a little bit of a trek through a dangerous wilderness kind of story, but there's a twist to it, because obviously, since this is the Time War, we are dealing with the Daleks in various capacities in each of these stories. Now, with Echoes of War, we have a Dalek that has been damaged in such a way that it doesn't quite remember what it is and what's going on. And so, because it has capabilities that the Doctor and the other folks don't have and kind of need, they team up with it. And it agrees to help them because it doesn't fully remember what it is. And so they haven't, and they're starting to trust it, and it's starting to have experiences that might teach it to trust them, but at the same time, they are all in fear that this thing is going to have a full memory recovery, remember what it is and what its goals are. And so that dynamic is interesting, and the Dalek not fully realizing what it is and its place in the universe effectively is a nice little sort of way to play with basically another spin on Enemy Mine. You know, it's fairly well, I mean, that wasn't even the first story to do it. It's just the first one that comes to my head. The sort of sci-fi people on opposite sides of a conflict. They got to work together to survive. It's not exactly a new story, but it's got a few little twists to it. And again, we're continuing to see fallout from the Time War across this story. So that moves things along as well. Unfortunately, in this installment, we also get introduced to, I think, easily the weakest character of the entire box set. It's a character who sticks around through the remaining entries. That character is a Time Lord holding the rank of Cardinal, and her name is Lystra. And okay, when she first shows up, she's pretty effective for what she is being utilized for, which is a very cold, very goal and results oriented military strategist type. She has no particular care for morality, she cares about results. And she has a very cold, very even delivery that works for that. Unfortunately, as the character sticks around, and as events continue to unfold around her, she maintains that same way of delivering lines, and it just starts to become inappropriate. It's not quite monotone, but for the situation she starts to find herself in, the fact that she is still as even-keeled as she is in her line delivery starts to read as just off. And it doesn't quite feel like the character is meant to be unflappable, because some of the lines, like on paper, are exasperated or fearful or concerned, but that never enters into the vocal delivery of those lines. And it makes the character, a character who had been functional, if slightly generic at first introduction, kind of grating by the end. And it's a shame, because she really is the only flat-out weak part of this entire box set. But by the time it was done, I didn't care for her at all. Which is a bummer. That's pretty rare that I have something in these big finished box sets that I can as definitively point to as like that didn't work, but I can with her. So moving on to the next story proper, we have The Conscript. Now in this, the Doctor has basically been chucked into basic training for the Time War with recruits much younger than him, and he is expected to fall in line. And there are things that I both like and dislike about this one. Although the things that I dislike about it are things that whenever I talk about this in relation to the Time Lords, because it's come up before when I've talked about them broadly speaking, I seem to be one of the only ones who really get annoyed by this. So again, speaking in general terms, I don't like when we find out things about the Time Lords and it runs too much of a parallel to human beings and Earth. So it's one of the things that bugs me about Heaven Sent. They have farms and just like effectively an Amish community. It's one of the things that bugs me about The Deadly Assassin. They have TV news broadcasts that are just, like our TV news. There's something very demystifying in a way that doesn't make them more interesting whenever we get this very overly familiar sense of who the Time Lords are and what they do. I'm not saying that the Time Lords as entities need to feel overly alien, but it frustrates me when their society feels so analogous to our own. It just feels like an easy shortcut, and it's just uninventive, and I kind of find it uninteresting. So I do find it frustrating that the general structure of this, the whole boot camp thing that the Doctor goes through, is pretty much, what you see. I mean, I'm not going to say what you go through when you go through boot camp. I've never been through boot camp. I have no idea. But it's the kind of thing that you see whenever boot camp gets depicted in films, television, etc. It very much falls in line with the expectations. There are a couple of twists here and there as far as getting, again, a little more insight into the way the Time War gets waged, both in terms of what the conscripts are getting trained to do and some other stuff that goes on later. So that helps a little bit. And also the characters are quite nice in this. The Doctor has a few to deal with. He has a commandant, effectively the drill sergeant, that is trying to not break him, but get him to fall in line. And that's a very well-handled character, especially considering he could have just been an unredeemable jerk. But he's obviously trying very hard to do the best he can to get young soldiers prepared for something that it is, by definition, impossible to be prepared for. And he seems to know that there's nothing that he can do that can truly properly prepare them for what they are about to go out and do. But he's still going to do the best that he can. It's a really well-balanced performance and quite a well-written character as well. And there are a couple of recruits who the Doctor kind of bonds with, and they are both well-performed. They have a nice sort of performance chemistry in contrast with each other, so that works pretty well too. And then there's the last story where everything kind of comes to a head, and we learn how all this is about the tracking down of this one specific thing that both the Daleks and the Time Lords want, and sort of the fallout from that. Now, I do have to get into spoilers on this last one, and I additionally will be addressing some spoilers from the earlier ones that I had to kind of skip over. So, that's your spoiler warning, and here we go. So, it turns out that what the Daleks and the Time Lords are after initially we get kind of a hint that they're tracking down the Doctor, of course, they're not. It turns out that Quarren is a Time Lord who used a Chameleon Circuit, and he has a pendant that, once he opens it up, he will restore his Time Lord personality. But what he is he is a Time Lord with the most extreme capabilities. They don't call them psychic, but it's something along those lines. Like, he has a grasp and a manipulation himself, not even through like a TARDIS or technology, but a manipulation of the time stream. He just has an inherent skill of that is off the charts. And there's a couple of things I like about this. The first is this last one is called One Life, and it's really great because for as nuts as the concepts are getting by this point, it's grounded in the relationship between Quarren and Rupa, his wife. And we get these flashes of how they met and, their lives together, their marriage and all these things. And then we realize most of that is manufactured and fake, because Quarren didn't just use a Chameleon Circuit to create an identity for himself. He created an entire history for both himself and Rupa that didn't actually happen. And it's quite sad to, first of all, some of the glimpses we get of that, because it's very real and very human, and then to see that unravel is quite sad. And it's a really good idea when you're dealing with concepts this abstract to ground the story, or at the very least the emotional core of the story, in understandable human traits, which this does, despite the fact that at this point we are talking about a being who is capable of rewriting the timeline on a whim. It still manages to ground it in a relationship that we can understand. So that makes it work. And I also kind of really like the idea that neither the Time Lords nor the Daleks had any interest in the Doctor. They were after somebody else. And part of what I like about that is it goes against the thing that I've railed against before, which is the Doctor being like the most amazing special thing ever in the history of the universe, which I don't care for. So I rather like this idea of he assumes because of his ego that they're all after him, but it's like, no, we don't care about you. This guy's like so much better than you are. I like that. And I also like seeing the Chameleon Circuit used yet again. So this now marks the third time we've seen it done. Makes you wonder how many other Time Lords did it in some way to try and escape the Time War. And also, it's really interesting, because once he opens it up and becomes his Time Lord self again, he's not an uncaring person, but he's much colder, and he's not the same person. And it is interesting that he was such a sweet, kind of timid guy, very much like John Smith was, very much like Professor Yana was. It makes me wonder, and I think I might even headcanon this, if the Chameleon Arch, when it is used to turn a Time Lord into a human, whether it by default or design gives them a fairly innocuous, low-key personality, because so far we've only ever seen that being used to help Time Lords to hide out, and if you're hiding out, you want to keep low-key. So I'm gonna headcanon it that part of the Chameleon Arch is to give them a kind of subdued, meeker personality, so that they don't make waves and don't get noticed too much if they can at all help it. But that was really interesting to see pan out. So getting back to some of the spoilers from earlier that I had to skip over, I really love. So the Starship of Theseus. If you haven't already listened to it, and you don't care about spoilers, so the thought exercise, the Ship of Theseus, is this idea of, okay, so there's this ship owned by a guy named Theseus, and at one point a board starts to rot, so he replaces that board, and over enough time he replaces another board, and over a long enough time, eventually every single board has been replaced, and not a single plank of the original ship is still there. Is it still the Ship of Theseus? And if it is, how, when none of the original physical material is still present? And if it isn't, at what point did it become no longer the original ship? When it was halfway converted, all the way, the minute you changed even one plank of it? When does that change? And I love seeing that applied to narrative. And it starts out with the Doctor who's with a companion that, he has an established rapport with, Sheena. And then a little bit later, he calls her Emma. And then it turns out, oh, no, that's not my name, it's something else. And, things are changing. And initially, it's that. And I didn't clock it initially because Sheena's not a recurring companion. So when he said the name a second time, it was something else, I thought he said Sheena. Oh, but then it changed again. I'm like, wait a minute. And then, we're finding out the ship, originally it was a cruise line. Oh, now it's a refugee ship. And just seeing the changes, and some of them are later on it sleeps, but little changes to the story that they are inhabiting, and to the point that Sheena gets erased and now gets thrown on the pile of companions who just never were. And so that's really clever. What ends up happening with Dal, the Dalek who doesn't remember being a Dalek, that is really kind of intriguing. That could have been very one note. I really enjoyed that. And with the conscript, I like the final note with, especially the more sort of patriotic of the recruits the Doctor bonds with, sticking to that. And she tells him, look, you go meet your destiny, I'm going to meet mine. And I do appreciate it when somebody in a situation like that is still going to stand by their principles, even knowing what it's going to cost them, saying, look, don't tell me I'm an idiot for doing this. I'm making a choice. Let me make it. And I do appreciate that. Overall, this was a pretty good box set. Not the best, and it did have the one character who I didn't like, but overall, pretty dang good. And I like the flavor of the Time War that it gives you. And it doesn't shove the Doctor too much into it. It does have him sort of skirting around the edge of it, which makes sense given what we saw in Night of the Doctor. So, Eighth Doctor, The Time War, Series 1. Have you heard it? What did you think about it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. There's other stuff to do as well. There's the Patreon, which helps support this, and it's why I actually got to listen to this at all. Plus, there's the like, the subscribe. Those are helpful. Other links besides, click on them. They'll take you places, but you also don't have to, because at the end of the day, you're the council. I'm only running meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.